This is particularly appropriate when we talk about muscle because there are so many layers. Anybody who's studied anatomy will be aware of the epimysium, perimysium, and endomysium. But in recent fascial research, they've shown that even those layers have layers within them, which I thought was fascinating. Hello folks, and welcome to our first inaugural episode of CMTV. I'm Aubrey Gowing.
And I'm Alison Kavanagh.
So in this episode, this being our first episode, we want to introduce some concepts and talk about the kind of material, I suppose the variety of stuff we're going to discuss over the course of these podcasts. That we're going to look at really things that myself and Ali talk about all the time ourselves, because we're such anatomy nerds, bodywork nerds, but we're interested in health, fitness, exercise, physiology. There's a whole broad spectrum of topics. I think I'll probably talk mostly about the kind of nearly pain management, dealing with chronic pain side of things.
I like the wellness stuff, the mindfulness, the practical things that we can do every day to keep our health in tip-top condition.
Yeah, so we covered a lot of different topics like general health principles, as well as things like specific kind of diets that are useful for particular conditions. We'll talk about what that condition is, how we would approach dealing with that. And some of that's going to be based on stuff like our dad would have been talking about in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, there's some really useful diets that help with complaints that people are suffering with, and they can lessen the effects of the condition if they know what foods help and what foods hurt.
Because it's amazing, wasn't it Hippocrates originally said, let food be your medicine and medicine be your food?
Absolutely.
But these things aren't new concepts. It's that I think stuff goes in and out of vogue at different times, in and out of the public consciousness, and in and out of kind of, I suppose, academic focus as well.
Yeah. And different things catch our attention at times. Like at the moment, I'm really interested in the antihistamine diet. Having been a sufferer of eczema and various rashes and even severe reactions to sunshine, I'm really curious about everything from the gut microbiome, how that influences histamine production, how it ties in with our immune system, and again, what foods help and what foods hurt.
Actually, that might be a good place to start. Do you want to start talking about that, or will I start on the topic I was going to discuss today was stretching?
Yeah, you go ahead.
Stretching? Okay.
Yeah.
So I think stretching is a really interesting topic, and we've talked about this on a couple of different media before. We've done little short clips on it. We've talked about it on different webinars and things that I've been a guest presenter at. But I think it's good to kind of lay some of the groundwork. So one of the things we find is that for quite a while now, there has been a turning away from stretching. A lot of people will tell you stretching is a waste of time, and the thing they'll always say is there's no evidence to support the benefits of stretching.
The efficacy.
Yeah, but I think we do have to look at what do we take as credible evidence. That I think there's been too much of a leaning on things like, the double-blind randomized controlled trials, which are great.
Gold standard, apparently.
Yeah, but they're not the only type of evidence. And oftentimes people will dismiss other types of evidence because they'll say it's not strong enough. But when you get a consistent enough response, or enough of a response over a broad selection of the population, that is pretty solid evidence. It may not be the same as the double-blind randomized controlled trial, but it is still evidence in and of itself. So I think because of that, people have moved away from the idea of stretching being beneficial. But I would always say, you look at how animals stretch. They haven't been indoctrinated in any specific ideology. They do it automatically. And there's a reason why they do it.
Instinctive.
Yeah. And I think the work that's been done by various fascial researchers over probably about the last nearly 20 years now at this stage has really informed an awful lot of what we think about how the body works, but in particular how stretching is going to be beneficial, because we now know that fascia is incredibly important. I mean, it's literally the structure that holds individual cells in place. It's what gives organs and muscles and everything really their contour, their shape. It defines their boundaries. It holds, but also separates one structure from another. But the problem is fascia can get kind of sticky. The ground substance in the fascia can dehydrate. And so layers that should be separate can become stuck to each other. And I think this is particularly appropriate when we talk about muscle, because there are so many layers. Anybody who's studied anatomy will be aware of the epimysium, perimysium, and endomysium. But in recent fascial research, they've shown that even those layers have layers within them, which I thought was fascinating. And if we look at how muscles go through this lengthening and shortening process, these fascial layers have to be able to slide out as the muscle lengthens, and they have to be able to slide back as the muscle shortens. And so to allow that, the layers have to be free to glide. There can't be any sticking between them. Whereas they can get stuck when we have the individual layers are getting dehydrated and compressed against each other. So, we actually have something telescopic there.
I just think this is really useful to illustrate how the fascia moves.
This would be like these stages in that fascia about how they slide out. So they're kind of telescopic. For those who can't see very clearly, this is kind of telescoping out, this being a pointer. And then as muscles shorten, each of these layers need to be able to slide back in so it can fully shorten, and slide out so it can fully lengthen. Now, if we stored this, particularly maybe in kind of damp conditions, maybe in this mid-range position, some of these might get stuck together. Yes, we can still have shortening a little bit, but we can't get full lengthening because these layers have become adhered to each other. They're stuck. If you think about it almost like getting rusty, and they can no longer elongate properly. So we lose the full function of the muscle, that it either can't fully shorten or it can't fully lengthen. Now, there's more to it than that, because really, I suppose in therapy, we're looking at, we always say, if we want to really de-jargon and make the process as simple as possible, we'd say we're really trying to unstick the stuff that's stuck. So getting these layers that should be unstuck, if they have become adhered, we want to get them freed out again. And manual therapy is excellent for that. But stretching is important to maintain that. That if we're always in the one position, stuff gets stuck.
I think even the wallpaper analogy of the ground substance in the fascia is quite useful, that it can get very rigid and glued and immovable, and that heat and movement and stretching, which brings in a number of different modalities, will change the consistency of that ground substance from wallpaper paste to a more gel-like,
almost like
pliable.
Water. Like a jelly water. So yeah, that's a good analogy, because if you add water to wallpaper paste, it becomes much more fluid. As it cures, as it dries out, as it's sticking the wallpaper to the wall, as it's becoming an adhesive, it is actually shedding moisture. It's drying out and becoming stickier. But if you add moisture back in, it goes back to being that flowing type of material again. And fascia does dehydrate when it becomes compressed, or when it's just not being moved enough, because movement really helps to hydrate the tissues.
So I think that brings in drinking the water, as well as getting manual therapy, and then stretching between treatments to make sure everything stays freed up.
Yeah, because therapy will only create what we call a window of opportunity, a period of time when stuff is less stuck and you can move more. But if you don't move, it'll go back to being stuck. So this is the importance of clients doing their home care, really, which is a challenge. I mean, having taught classes all around the world, therapists will always say, that's the big challenge, getting clients to engage in the process of home care. They'll come in for treatment, but it's getting them to do their part outside the treatment room is always going to be key.
Maintenance is key.
Yeah. Another really great piece of information that I came across recently that I thought was mind-blowing in terms of supporting, this is research evidence that supports the benefits of stretching. Fascial researcher, Dr. Helene Langevin, one of my favorite researchers at the moment, working out of Harvard, did research to show that stretching actually helps to produce what they call pro-resolving enzymes. These are enzymes that help to resolve the inflammatory process. So in very simple terms, you could say stretching helps to reduce inflammation. And that's the mechanism. We would have thought before that stretching was beneficial, but not necessarily in relation to inflammation in particular. Now, we would have thought of it as part of the ladder of recovery, where we talk about from traumatic injury. You need to go through these stages where you want to start off with range of motion to stop stuff from sticking together too much. Then go into pain-free stretching, because pain-free is always the key. Make sure you're not creating more damage. And then at the late stage, you're doing pain-free strength training to rehabilitate tissues to get you fully back into sport. So the idea that stretching is actually going to help to take you from the acute to the subacute, and even subacute to chronic, or hopefully not chronic, that you're fully rehabbed rather than having a long-term injury, but that it can help resolve that inflammation, particularly mopping up the late stages, the last bits of inflammatory processes.
Yeah.
So really, really interested to find out about that. I thought that was quite fascinating. And it does support the idea of doing stretching. So let us know if you guys have more questions around that, because we can come back to that topic again. I just thought it was nice to look at that in and of itself as a really important element of supporting the idea of stretching. Oh, one more thing we would say before we move on to the mast cells is that it's not that you should stretch everything. There are muscles in the body that are going to be predictably tight, and we can verify that through muscle length tests and things like that, that if they're predictably tight, they'll benefit from stretching. But their antagonist, their counterpart, their opposite, is generally going to be weak and inhibited. And this is where strengthening really comes into its own, that weak muscles will benefit from being strength trained. Tight muscles, they'll generally get worse if you try and strength train them. Equally, if you have a weak muscle, and you stretch it, it's going to get worse. Whereas if you get the balance right, figure out which muscles are tight and stretch them, figure out which muscles are weak and strength train them, then you're going to come to a point of equilibrium. And at that point, all of the muscles should be capable of both being strong and flexible. So you should be able to strength train and stretch successfully.
Yeah, that's the ideal. But I think in the early stages, remembering that you have to release the tight muscles first, because neurologically they're inhibiting their opposing muscle. So release tight muscles first and then strengthen the weak ones. And then obviously we can strengthen everything.
Good point, because that kind of ties it back into our overarching principles that we would say you're always going to treat tight muscles before you treat weak, for exactly that reason. You can't really get very lasting effects with a weak muscle if it's still neurologically inhibited by a tight muscle opposing it.
Yeah.
Great.
Good.
Anything else on that before we talk about mast cells?
No, I think that's good.
Okay, so let's talk about mast cells.
Yeah, so I'm just fascinated, having struggled with the skin issues and really not knowing what the actual triggers were, having tried gluten-free, various diets, and just still getting flare-ups, particularly taking vacation, going for a sun holiday, and people go, oh, I get allergies or food tolerances, and people go, yeah, everybody has something like that. And then you show them the photos and you're unrecognizable, and they're kind of going, that was from a few days in the sun. And I'm like, yeah.
You've had some very strong reactions.
Yeah, we might put up a photo or two if I'm feeling brave.
Maybe just take it back a step and just explain what a mast cell is, like what system of the body it belongs to, and a bit of an idea of its function.
Yeah. Well, I suppose mast cells are located throughout the body, and their function is to produce histamine. Histamine will cause fluid to flood into an area. So it's nearly like a way of flushing out irritants. So we'd have high histamine production if there was pollen irritating us, or if we were allergic to dust or pet hair or something like that. So there can be various different triggers or irritants that can cause the mast cells to produce histamine, which is useful. But then if you have overproduction, the increase in fluid in the tissues can become problematic.
And aren't there the highest concentration nearly just under the skin as well?
There's a lot under the skin, and there's a lot in the digestive tract as well. Yeah, so if there is damage to the gut lining, so where we have kind of a Velcro attaching the cells where absorption takes place in the large bowel, if that Velcro gets weakened, then more histamine gets into the bloodstream, and again can affect many different areas. So it can have seemingly different symptoms showing up, from bloating, from skin irritations, from irritation in the eyes, from stuffy nose, headaches. So there's a lot of correlation. They can overlap with symptoms of other conditions. So they can be seemingly quite random, and you don't realize that possibly this is to do with overproduction of histamine. And then we're looking at foods that are high in histamine, foods that cause a release in histamine, and then foods that are low in histamine. And we don't want to be on a low histamine diet forever. This is really kind of a short process of elimination to get the mast cells to correct the level of histamine they're producing. So histamine is relevant, it's really helpful, but it's the overproduction that can become problematic.
I remember one of the things we were saying about the life cycle of a histamine cell. They're generally about 2 years, in which sometimes as much as 4, but generally within 2 years, most mast cells are replaced. But the problem is, as new cells are coming online, if you still have this excess production in some, it nearly trains the new ones into that hypersensitivity.
Yeah.
So that's what we're talking about, that there's a window that you'd need to be quite strict maybe with that diet?
Yes, yeah. They say even initially 2 to 3 weeks to cut out all the high histamine foods to allow the mast cells to come back to a more normal level of production. Within a few days, you'll notice the any skin irritations calming down. And then there's a whole host of supplements and things that can help. So it's kind of taking it in stages to heal the gut, get the mast cell histamine production at a more regulated level, and figuring out which foods are the particular trigger for you, because sensitivities will vary from person to person.
Yeah, what I thought was interesting was the difference between foods that are high in histamine themselves won't actually affect you as much as foods that will increase your histamine production, because it's the endogenous, the histamine you're producing is actually the big factor, wasn't it?
More relevant.
If I remember right. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And one of the things we were talking about, and probably something we're going to experiment with on ourselves, is kicking off that process of trying to just improve gut health with the use of iodine drops for 2 weeks, we reckon.
Yeah, we were saying that SIBO may be relevant where you have small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So where the flora and fauna, the balance of good bacteria in the colon, the lower digestive tract, is really relevant. In some cases, it has travelled up into the small intestine as well, and it's not necessary there. So using something, you can be harmful. So using something like iodine to kill the small intestinal bacteria overgrowth. They're saying there's a breath test you can do to see if you have that it can monitor whether you have bacteria in the small intestine or not. And as I said, a very simple, a drop or two of iodine under the tongue on an empty stomach seems to cleanse out that bacteria from the small intestine and start the process of building up the microbiome with a wide variety of good bacteria.
There's nearly 2 stages. The first stage was taking the iodine to improve the health of we could say the first stage of the intestine, like really that small intestine. And then the second stage for the bowel was...
For the colon.
Yeah.
To start introducing a variety of gut bacteria that help the gut to function, and whether that's feeding the gut bacteria. With the histamine, high levels of histamine foods, they say fermented food should be avoided, which is a bit of a problem when you're trying to build up the good bacteria in the gut. But again, not all foods are created equally. If you have a really good homemade kimchi, a teaspoon of that a day might be perfect. Whereas if it's something that's very processed, maybe has a lot of sugar in it, some of the kombuchas or sauerkrauts may not be suitable. So aged foods and highly processed foods seem to trigger a very high histamine response within the body. So cooking things fresh, not eating leftovers, anything that bacteria has an opportunity to grow on. Even things like ground beef, because it's more chopped up, there's more of the surface available for bacteria to develop on. So
or mincemeat, as we call it here in Ireland. I think the US, they tend to say
ground beef. So if you buy produce, you cook it the day you get it or you freeze it. So just being really aware of how to keep the bacteria levels minimized while you're healing the gut and getting the histamine response lowered to avoid the reactions.
Yeah, because I think that would have huge implications for how well your immune system overall is functioning. That it's certainly going to be really beneficial for the mast cells, but that is part of the immune system. So you're also talking about in the digestive tract, the Peyer's patches. We're talking about improving the mucosal linings. There's a whole knock-on effect. We're going to be trying this out, and we're trying out a particular probiotic. We won't name a brand yet. We'll try it out and we'll get back. So we'll probably do a follow-up on this.
I think we'll do a follow-up and actually give you the foods that are known to be high in histamine, that cause a histamine release, and a few options for what you can try out instead while you're on this low histamine diet for a period of 2 or 3 weeks. So it really is trial and error, seeing what foods you have a strong reaction to and knowing that you can heal from this. And that's really what we're interested in, getting the best results.
Because I think they were saying, we've looked at a few different experts talking about this kind of stuff, as well as trying it out ourselves and doing a good bit of background reading on it, that it's wider spread than people realize, but it's maybe not all of the population. So there is going to be an element of trial and error, I think, for the histamine stuff. But I think in terms of promoting gut health and boosting immune function, I think almost anybody could benefit from that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And one of the big things that I think has come more into the public awareness is the impact that stress has on immune function. That the more stressed you are, the more suppressed your immune system becomes. So dealing with good gut health and dealing with good immune health will actually help to improve your overall well-being beyond just like your ability to fight off a cold or flu or something like that. That it is about overall health within the body. And I think recovering from stress, like people suffering from burnout, I think that's happening probably more now. People are very career focused, like ourselves, we're no exception, that if you put an awful lot into work and then you have family demands and you have all these different stressors upon you, people sometimes think that suffering from stress is somehow a failure. But I think it's kind of nearly one of these effects of modernity that everybody is suffering a certain amount of stress. And so to varying degrees, there's going to be that bit of suppression on the immune system. Bringing that back up is really going to have a huge impact. And even talking about the relationship between the information that goes from the gut to the brain, that communication system.
The relevance of the vagus nerve, I think that could be a whole subject in itself. And what quite interested me is what are the emotional states that can be tied in with the histamine production, and kind of maybe being on high alert or being inclined to panic a little bit of and feeling overloaded or overwhelmed, and there the body starts to pump out high levels of histamine. So I think it's really interesting to look at all the different layers that impact how the body is responding physically.
And even like things like the things you're watching, like if you're looking at a lot of doom and gloom stuff, the doom scrolling, as they say, your body doesn't know the difference. It thinks these threats from your emotional state is real. So even thinking in terms of what you consume intellectually as part of your diet, I always think of that like, I don't necessarily want to consume this. It's not just food. It's the things you're exposing yourself to. That if you're dealing with a lot of stress just from that kind of like doom scrolling on social media, your body's responding as though you were actually in a stressful situation. So thinking about how you're going to moderate or modulate that. Are you happy with the way things are? Or if you want to make change, I always think like these things are never about a judgment. It's not good or bad. It's more, are you happy with the way things are? If you're not entirely satisfied with your current state of health, what are some of the elements you can look at? And it is that kind of like mind, body, spirit, or they oftentimes talk about now the biopsychosocial, that it's not one thing is the answer. There is oftentimes multiple interrelated factors.
Absolutely. And I think the attitude of gratitude is something that's very important. And then our particular area of interest, the holistic approach, where you really are taking in all the different elements that can impact you and stacking the odds in your favour.
I thought it was interesting the point you were making as well, is that part of the histamine response is oftentimes maybe in reaction to an emotional state of fear. And that can be quite broad. It's not just that you have a phobia and you're terrified of one specific thing. It can be this ongoing level of anxiety, but it's a fear in the background. Nearly the underlying emotion from anxiety is kind of fear. And so even getting yourself out of that fear state,
so important.
It can be hard to identify like what's causing that, where it's very ingrained. Oftentimes it's nearly unconscious.
Absolutely.
So looking at those kind of things, what causes you anxiety, what stresses you out, how can you deal with that?
And you can be inclined to just have the next attitude, and you're really just pushing yourself all the time, and just kind of stepping back and taking time to go, do I really need to be pushing this hard all the time?
And even celebrating the wins. Little wins along the way, that you really take time to appreciate that it takes you out of the idea that everything is always a challenge, or that, you're always focusing on the problem. That instead you go, oh, well, here was a success. Take a moment to go, that was great. Instead of going, oh, that worked. Next. Which I think everybody is guilty to some extent. And it's just a little change in attitude.
Okay, folks. Well, I hope you enjoyed our first podcast today, and we look forward to bringing you many, many more.
And we would always say, let us know in the comments what kind of things you'd like us to discuss, because I think the focus of this is going to change nearly episode to episode, where we're talking about things that are of interest to us, different things that are coming up, different, like what are we reading, what are we engaged by at the moment, what are we trying out when we're experimenting on ourselves. I think all of that is going to be driving the content in general, but obviously we want to be responsive to what do you guys want to hear about. We also probably have some interviews coming up as well, where we'll talk to different experts. Some of these we might even do as lives, which we'll talk about well ahead of time on social media. So be sure and like and subscribe to us on social media, or follow our channel wherever you may be watching or listening to this podcast. And we look forward to hearing that engagement and responding to that as we go along.
I think you'll enjoy some of the simple steps that we'll set out for you to try out at home and see how you get on.
Yeah. So thanks for listening, folks, and we'll see you again soon.